Today, let's talk about building a project plan. To be clear, in this episode, I am not going to talk about many of the technical aspects of physically constructing a schedule, like finish to start relationships versus finish to finish, start to start, leads, lags, critical path, float, and other base concepts. We'll get to all of those in time. And we're going to keep all of this tool independent, at least for the most part. What I do want to talk about today is a couple of techniques to help ensure an elegant schedule design. Wait a minute. Elegant and project schedule, how does that work? For one, an elegantly constructed schedule is helpful for those not nearly as excited about project planning as you and I. It helps them to understand the schedule. The whole team should understand the schedule, and as much as I'd want that whole team to understand all of the nuts and bolts, I'd be dreaming. Team members have various priorities. It's not their fault that they don't want to focus on the schedule all the time. They're primarily managing the execution of their own piece of the puzzle, their own work, and keeping their internal and external suppliers and customers happy. While the schedule is certainly one important resource for them, as I said, they do have other things going on, other priorities. So one of my own priorities as a planner is to make this schedule glanceable for them and allow them to quickly understand where their work is at overall and where their inputs and outputs stand. My first step in constructing a more elegant schedule is to keep the tools out of it, at least for the first part. I'm going to meet with the engineers and managers that will be contributing to the schedule, but mostly verbally at first, just face to face, just having a conversation. The temptation is to start interviewing them and then as they talk, build activities into the schedule, supporting the breakout of their work. But again, I'm going to put the laptop aside. And I'm not saying that you're wrong if you don't, but go with me on this. Because what I've found is if I have an overall discussion, a sort of verbal flyover of the engineer's work in the discussion format, I end up with something better later on in terms of that project plan. So when I meet with them, I'll surely focus on the activities in their work, the resources that they'll need, and as we talked about last week, I may challenge them on the estimated timeframes for their activities, noting that when I hear a lot of 1 week, 2 week, and 1 month activity estimates, I might be concerned that the estimates are a little fast and loose, and there may be some optimism bias and some underlying unsafe assumptions that support these estimates. One thing that I will focus on in those discussions is questions like this. What do you need to start your work, and which business function do you receive that from? How will you know that you've received everything from that business function? Two different questions, similar, but also different at the same time. And then I'll ask the person providing me information, when your work is done, who do you give the work product to? Which function, person, or organization? How will you know that they are satisfied with your work product in a way that allows them to perform their work? These are some of the most important questions that you can ask because this will allow you to build the project plan elegantly and modularly. If you've designed systems or processes, you know that things can work very well and become less complicated with an input and output approach. Some people would call this a giver-receiver design of a schedule. What this means is that if I have an entity of work, things are just less complicated if there are lean, discrete inputs to that entity, and then a clear, lean, discrete description of the outputs or outcomes. In short, something goes in, gets changed or used in some way, and then something else comes out. To me, this is a process element in its purest form. This video I'm filming right now, its input is ideas, concepts, and experiences, and its output is this physical video that consolidates that information into a fairly quick and succinct video that you're watching right now. That same logic can readily apply to your own project schedule. Now, don't get me wrong. Many of my own schedules, especially the ones that I constructed early in my career, had handoffs between functions all over the place, not necessarily in any kind of giver-receiver format, from a detailed activity in one area of the project plan directly to a detailed activity owned by a different function somewhere else in the schedule. While I was certainly able to trace critical path and produce reports from that type of design, the reports were jumping all over the place from function to function, and it was hard to follow even for me, who had actually built the schedule myself. What I learned to do, and I just copied this approach from more experienced planners, I did this. When I had a link into one function's schedule from an outside function, I linked it to a milestone area above an engineer's work called inputs, and then also outputs. You could call this givers receivers, and many people do. So in the case of an input or a receiver to that engineer's work, a giver from the supplying function linked to a receiver milestone for my engineer, and then the receiver milestone is linked into that engineer's detailed plan. And when that same engineer produces work product to be given to another function, I link that activity to a giver milestone in the giver-receiver section, and then that giver links to a receiver milestone in another area of the plan. One person's giver is another person's receiver. Using this method, you'll have more rows of data in your schedule. You will have a longer schedule. Because each time an engineer has a handoff to another function, you'll first link to the giver milestone, and then link the giver milestone to another function's receiver milestone. I don't see more rows as a bad thing because of the advantages, and let's talk about some of those. For one, those givers and receivers are clearly listed and segregated in the schedule. And especially when forming the baseline, it gives everyone an overview of what those giver-receiver expectations are between functions in a separate area above each function's detailed internal work. When tracing critical path or other important paths in the schedule, it's easier to see where cross-functional handoffs occur. Those can be risk points. Say I deliver something to you. I believe I'm done. But you're looking at my work saying, this is not everything that I need to do my work. A risk has potentially been realized at that point. My impression of what you needed and what you actually received, those were two different things. By illustrating those handoffs very clearly in the schedule up front, you and I have the opportunity at baseline to agree on what those handoffs truly look like in terms of both scope and content. This approach can also let the project manager know that there are potentially dozens more handoffs between functions than originally expected, anticipated, or desired. This can be its own risk in and of itself, as there may be opportunities to lean out the cross-organizational chaos and plan the project differently, perhaps with fewer handoffs overall. Now, there's no one right answer on this. Some projects are just going to be super complicated and have, dozens or hundreds of these givers, receivers, or inputs and outputs. But if there is an opportunity to reduce complication, many folks will jump at that. I'm not saying every schedule will be constructed perfectly with the elegance and style that I'm talking about here. And frankly, once the project hits stride in execution, this approach can decay as you're just trying to keep up with the dynamic nature of execution in many types of projects. But what I do believe is that if you can build the baseline with this disciplined, process and systems-oriented approach of receive and do the work and then give, you're setting yourself up to have a schedule that when reported on is easier for the team to understand, much easier to spot risks and potential variances in those handoffs before they occur. And the more you know up front, the earlier that you know it, the better chance the team has to adjust course and execute on time. Thanks for watching today. Use those comments down below for your comments and questions, and we'll see you next time.